Good day. I am Henry Mostert, the DST NRF Saatchi Research Chair for Mineral Law in Africa, hosted by the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And I'm here today with three colleagues, all of them alumni of the Saatchi for Mineral Law in Africa, who have all completed their postgraduate degrees through the Saatchi Research Chair before going in to establish themselves as scholars in mineral and energy law in various African jurisdictions. When the academic advisory group of the International Bar Association's Sector for Energy, Environment, Resources and Infrastructure Law decided to put together a book on resilience in energy and resource law, the four of us joined forces to interrogate the consequences that the COVID-19 pandemic had for resource-dependent economies in Africa. And we wanted to examine the effects specifically that financing the crisis had on the resource sectors and government systems in our respective jurisdictions. We are not able to join Milton Montoya's webinar about the newly launched book on resilience in energy and resources law, but we've offered to contribute through this recording of a panel discussion on our chapter. And our chapter was entitled, "How Strong Can You Stand If You're on Your Knees? Financing Crisis in Africa, the Implications for the Natural Resource and Energy Sectors." Allow me to introduce my co-authors. First, we have Dr. Chris Adumaku Kwache. He is a PhD graduate of the Chair and a senior lecturer at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Ghana. And we also have Mr. Kangwa Musole Chisanga. He is a master's graduate of the Chair and a lecturer at the National Institute of Public Administration in Zambia. And Professor Meyer van den Berg. He is a PhD graduate of the Chair and adjunct faculty at UCT and a lecturer at the University of Namibia, as well as a consultant for ESI Windhoek. He is himself also a new member of the AAG. We thought we'd structure this contribution by looking at three questions. The first is, how did the COVID-19 pandemic and other disasters affect the Namibian, Zambian, Ghanaian, and South African societies, and how did it affect the natural resources sector specifically? Second question is, what the measures were that were taken in each of the countries to finance the response to COVID-19, and where did that leave the country in terms of debt feasibility? And the third question is, what are the outlooks now for each of our countries, and to what extent are those outlooks supported by our extractive sectors? Coming from Cape Town, I still very well remembered the panic around heading towards day zero a couple of years ago, when the taps in Cape Town would run dry because of a prolonged drought, but also problems in the water management. We managed to avert the water crisis by probably just a week or two, but that was still very much in the memory of the people here when COVID-19 struck and hard lockdown was imposed and we all had to stay at home and a state of disaster was declared. To be faced with those kind of drastic measures, just as we were coming out of that kind of crisis, surely had its effects on the economy. It was estimated that our economy shrank by more than a third, closer to a half, and that unemployment was at an all-time high. So maybe you can tell me about the climate-related crises in your various jurisdictions and what COVID-19 did to that.
COVID-19 came at a time when Namibia was just recovering from one of its worst droughts in 90 years. The effects of El Niño could be felt in Namibia, where droughts have led to a national disaster being declared in 2019. 1 year later, a state of emergency was declared as a result of COVID. Our president reacted very quickly and declared a national state of emergency. This was followed by countrywide lockdowns, curfews, businesses closed, schools closed, universities closed.
Southern Africa as a whole was going through the drought. And so we also had water shortages, but they affected our electricity supply because we have largely hydroelectric power. And so the lower levels in the dams meant that the output of electricity was lower. And so we were used to sort of rolling blackouts. Zambia's response was also quite quick, but for an entirely different reason. We had a cholera outbreak the year before, and the protocols regarding washing hands and having sanitation measures upped were already in place because the cholera outbreak pretty much required a similar thing. And so we were able to contain what would otherwise have been quite a serious public health disaster very quickly. But economically, COVID-19 also found us a bit on our knees because the years, particularly 2016 up to 2019, there was a lot of borrowing and mismanagement of funds. So the economy wasn't in a great state when COVID-19 hit, and the pandemic pretty much exacerbated that.
In Ghana, unlike the other areas where they had drought, we had some challenges with respect to development in wetland areas. People resorted to filling those places and then putting up buildings. And it caught up with us because water needed to find its level. And that was just at the end, and then the COVID also set in. What happened then was that we practiced the open market system. And because of the lockdown, people were not allowed to go and fill the markets. So again, it brought untold hardship on the people because commercial activities gradually came to a halt because you couldn't go out. So basically, these were some of the challenges Ghana faced during the COVID era.
In South Africa, government didn't have the money to finance the COVID-19 response. One of their reactions was to recalibrate the budget, to reallocate funds into the health sectors. The unemployment insurance fund in South Africa had to get a boost because the unemployment figures were raised significantly. And in South Africa, there was also significant borrowing, international borrowing, and great reliance on private sector funds. I think Zambia was probably, of all of our 4 jurisdictions, the one that was in the direst of straits, if you can say it like that.
By the time the pandemic had hit, we were already in a term debt unsustainable position. And so options regarding financing for COVID responses were very, very thin. One found very, very strange combinations of sources. Institutions we were getting money from, for instance, the International Development Agency of the World Bank, were not able to give us full credit. So there's like hybrid between a loan and grant funding, but just enough to get you the vaccines through and not increase your already debt unsustainable position. And we found those regarding the vaccines and also stimulus packages for financial service providers, because there was a fear that if there was no cash to do business, we would actually be setting ourselves up for a repeat of the global financial crisis. And so the Bank of Zambia was able to pull together some money to put into financial service providers. But the whole thing was to make sure that the debt doesn't balloon to a place where it becomes completely unsustainable. What we did see was that in as much as there was a need to get more money into the economy, there was an avoidance of getting more debt and letting that pile on. So we were fortunate enough to get some grant funding on board, especially for these emergency type funds. And that pretty much is how Zambia averted getting into even deeper debt due to the pandemic.
I think the same kind of situation was prevalent in Namibia, maybe not as immediately threatening, but Meyer, you would have a better sense of what was going on the ground in Namibia.
As a result of the drought we've been suffering before COVID, Namibia was already severely indebted through drought relief programs and loans from international organizations for drought relief. And then when the COVID pandemic hit and already crippled Namibian economy, Namibia had to resort to outside funding to try and alleviate the local pressure. Government put in place an economic stimulus package. The purpose of this was to provide once-off income grants to affected persons. Another mitigating measure that government imposed to try and mitigate the effects of the COVID pandemic was to introduce a salary protection scheme through the Social Security Commission, similar to the Unemployment Insurance Fund in South Africa. And through this, government tried to provide wage subsidies to employers, to motivate employers, specifically in the construction, tourism, and aviation sectors, not to retrench employees.
What was interesting about the Ghanaian situation is that Ghana had the foresight to create a sovereign wealth fund from its resources sector. The availability of the sovereign wealth fund at least created a kind of a buffer. Don't you want to tell us about that?
Right. Under our Petroleum Revenue Management Act, there is this sovereign wealth fund, the Ghana Stabilization Fund, and then the Ghana Heritage Fund. The Stabilization Fund, the object of that particular fund is to assist the state when we are unable to realize funds and then there's a disaster. That money can come in to support the government. On the other hand, the Ghana Heritage Fund basically deals with reserving money for future generation. And so when COVID struck, cash was very hard to come by. So the first resort was for the government to go into this particular fund. So the Bank of Ghana also had an act. It says that Bank of Ghana can provide money to the government in times of distress. That particular provision also gave the government a leeway, and then the government was able to secure some funding from the Bank of Ghana. That also brought a lot of hardship on our economy, to the extent that you are having to pay interest. Some people would be redeeming their bonds and bills, and it's really affected the financial sector. So with that, the government then needed to move out and look for money because people are not working, taxes are not being collected as they should. There is the need to make sure that you get the medicine and then the vaccines for people. So we went to the World Bank, we went to the IMF, we went to the African Development Bank, and all of them granted us concessionary loans. So when we look at the funds we have received, it's a lot, and that also has increased the debt portfolio. It is now getting to uncontrollable levels. The amount of money we are using to pay our interest on loans is such that we need to pull the brakes and then have a second look on how we are increasing the debt portfolio.
What we're seeing is that the consequences are so harsh that even for those who had a little bit more resilience going into the pandemic, the consequences are still very difficult to deal with. As we were writing this particular chapter, I was wondering about better harnessing our resources sector, one of the main wealth producing parts of the African continent, to create that kind of resilience going forward.
So this publication and this cooperation has come at a very opportune time for Namibia. You know, we're coming out of COVID now, but at the same time, we're trying to rebuild our economy. And part of that is trying to introduce more investor-friendly legislation. But government is also re-looking at our minerals legislation and our petroleum legislation and also our environmental legislation. It's long overdue that government should realize the benefit of the petroleum and the minerals industry to try and use that industry in a more optimal, investor-friendly, but also citizen-friendly manner to contribute more optimally to the local economy, aside from just imposing taxes on mining enterprises, charging limited royalties, and making sure that there's preferential local employment.
Zambia had a change of government in 2021. That has shown a lot of places where the policy priorities have shifted, and nowhere is this more evident than in the minerals and energy sector. Going into the election, which was sort of the pandemic period, 2020 to 2021, it felt like the Zambian government of the day was very much fighting with the mining sector. And then after there having been a change of government, what we've seen is mending of fences between the government and the mining sector and the energy sector as well. What we are leveraging is not necessarily the hard resources, right? It's sort of the softer side of it, which is just sort of managing the investor confidence and the investor relationships. What I have seen is that because we are dealing with the investor confidence as a government and building that back up again, we will be on good footing to either renegotiate some of these resource for infrastructure deals and actually get them onto a proper footing. And so that's sort of my optimistic outlook, because like I said, we have had a change of government. And so that is very much what I'm expecting to see as an academic and a scholar in this field.
I think that the natural resource sector gives developing resource-rich countries a lot of revenue. And I am of the opinion that if our governments ensure that they keep some of these monies aside for purposes of falling on them during difficult times, basically through a legislation that will assist us in managing these things, I think that African countries will be doing well. We will not be going around begging for loans and other facilities.
Thank you. That was a great summary of the lessons we've also learned. I can relate to that. Also, what I noticed was the wisdom that is already existent within the jurisdictions, and that wisdom and knowledge as a resource is also there for us to tap from. I'm also going to say that some personal benefits have come for us from this chapter. I know Casey, for instance, has won an award at his institution for his contribution to this. So congratulations, Casey. I think that it has been a great way for us also to broaden our horizons in terms of the kind of work that we are doing at mineral law in Africa. What should we do next? What is the work that we should do next to make sure that what we have learned from this process doesn't go to waste?
I believe the next thing we should do is continue to examine the close relationship between the minerals and the energy sector, because in the spirit of building a buffer towards it, we still have energy as a very vital developmental priority that our minerals, which are finite, right, they must still help us meet. And so for me, what I would be looking forward to is having a project where we actually look at points of intersection between what is happening in mineral policy and the priorities there, and what needs to happen in the energy sector as well. And then as lawyers, think of how the legal framework can better reflect this. I believe that's the contribution that I will be working towards in the next few years.
You'll be very pleased to know that the next AAG book that will come out in 2 years' time is going to be on zero emissions, on sovereignty and solidarity, and on the mineral and energy nexus. So I think the kind of work that you think we should be doing over the next couple of years are definitely going to be a conversation with the work of the AAG. And I am very much looking forward to being a part of that as well.